I am so excited to get into some wild card weekend playoff stuff for the real sickos out there. But before we jump into that, let's get a little retrospective because hindsight's 2025. A little explanation on this segment. Mello and I have each brought 3 players that we thought overperformed relative to ADP this season. We want to take a look back at why these players performed better than the fantasy community thought they would and how we can take that lesson into the 2026 draft. So we're going to kick things off. I'm going to go with a guy that I think a lot of people think of when you bring up this topic. I'm going to start with Javonte Williams. ADP of running back 35 and half PPR finishes as the RB11. I think that this is a huge lesson to all of us about ambiguous backfields. And I think we hear a lot about that during the draft season, but it's a lot harder to pull the trigger than it is to talk about it. And you looked at the Dallas Cowboys. This was a high-powered offense with a bad defense, and it's like a fantasy match made in heaven. We know that they wanted to move the ball down the field. We knew that they had traded Micah Parsons. They didn't have the defensive firepower to keep games close, and so they were going to have to push the ball. And so I think looking back for me, he was a guy that I should have had starred as a way, way higher guy than outside of the top 32 running backs. I think people were scared off by guys like Jaden Blue and Miles Sanders. And so I think for me, the lesson I'm going to take from Javonte Williams is next season, look for those teams with good offenses, bad defenses for fantasy gold, and look for those ambiguous backfields where maybe you take the shot and you miss, but at an RB35 price tag, you're not missing out on much if it doesn't hit.
I absolutely love this one. I think we see this every year with a few different backs, these ambiguous backfields, maybe a guy who's a little bit less proven going later in drafts. And they don't always hit, but that's kind of the beauty with a guy like Javonte Williams is if they don't hit, it's not costing you high draft capital, but you still have that ceiling with a lot of the guys going earlier in drafts. So, I mean, even just this year alone, you look at a guy like Travis Etienne sort of fits that similar mold. And, the examples go on and on year after year. So I think there's plenty of guys that kind of fit this criteria that we push too far down in drafts every year where we really shouldn't.
All right, who do you got for your pick?
I'm going to start with some low hanging fruit here. I'm going to go with maybe the most obvious, overachiever on the season based on ADP. And I'm going to go with Drake May, finished as the quarterback 2. Was getting drafted as the quarterback 16. And he was actually a guy I really did like in the preseason. And before I get too high on my metaphorical horse here, I did pick mostly guys that I myself was out on, just like a lot of the folks in the fantasy community. But Drake May is a guy I liked, and we can talk about everything he's achieved this year and how good he's been, but I won't waste too much time on that. We already all know that. He's an MVP candidate. He's been sensational. But if we really look at this from that hindsight lens, going back to this preseason, he was an unproven quarterback, but one with a lot of talent on paper, a really high ceiling, and then most importantly, a guy who ran the ball. He ran the ball quite a bit as a rookie, and that's kind of really important in fantasy football when it comes to quarterbacks. One of my favorite stats this past offseason was from 2015 to 2024, so a 10-year sample. There were 10 second-year quarterbacks who had 400-plus rushing yards as rookies. All 12 of them hit on their ADP. All 12 of them exceeded their expectations from a fantasy football perspective. And Drake May was no exception. He obviously fit that criteria and has just been beyond sensational this year. So big takeaway this year is, or for every year going forward really, is those young unproven quarterbacks that are going a little bit later in drafts, draft for ceiling, draft for guys who run the ball. Don't take the boring pocket passers who have a lower ceiling. Even a guy like Matthew Stafford, who's put together best year of his career, future Hall of Famer, another MVP candidate. That ceiling is still so limited when you're not running the ball. So look for those second-year quarterbacks especially. They're often unproven. They are often pretty athletic. And just one name I want to throw out there for the next season is Jackson Dart, a guy who admittedly I didn't really like a lot as a prospect necessarily in real life football. But I mean, this year he's proven he's a great athlete. He's a great player. Hasn't fully come together for him yet. So I think his price will be really affordable going into next year. And he definitely meets that criteria of a guy who runs the ball at over 400 yards rushing this season. So not that he's going to be Drake May. I'm by no means saying that. But if we're trying to learn from this hindsight, that's a guy you can look for next year.
That's a really interesting pick too, because I feel like going into this season, a huge knock on Drake May and the Patriots in general was that he didn't have a receiving core around him and didn't have the weapons. Then you look at Jackson Dart's situation. I mean, he's going to have Scatabo back. He's going to have Malik Neighbors. He's going to have Wandale Robinson, shortest 1,000-yard receiver ever. I, I think all the pieces are there, and I actually love that pick so much. And I'm going to put him towards the top of my buy low guys going into next year.
You and me both, brother.
All right, I'm going to hit you with another quarterback. This guy is one that I wavered on even including, but I'm going to include weeks 1 through 13 Daniel Jones. He was QB 34 off the board outside of all of the starting quarterbacks because we had that weird stretch where everyone thought Anthony Richardson was going to be playing. And he finished as the QB 7 after week 13. The reason I want to talk about Daniel Jones here is because I think we're entering into this weird era of the fit being very important for the quarterback and seeing a lot of these former first round draft picks kind of fizzle out and then go to a new team and get, reborn per se in a new system. And so that's something I'm going to be looking out for this offseason. One guy that comes to mind for me, I've had a soft spot for him, but I've had difficulty watching him the past few years. Kyler Murray stands out to me. I think Kyler Murray showed so much promise. You talk about those guys who can get it done on the ground, and like those first few seasons, man, we were drafting Kyler Murray in the top 6, 7 quarterbacks off the board. I see a world where let's say he goes to the Saints next year. He takes Tyler Shuck's job. Where's Kyler Murray going? QB 24, 25, maybe. And I think that he's the type of guy that if they put the right thing together, if they have Kellen Moore building out a system for him that puts him in a position to succeed, you could see Kyler Murray as like a low-end quarterback one. And for us best ball drafters, like that's music to my ears. You want a guy that you don't need to make the start-sit decision every week. And so I think for me, I'm looking at the Daniel Jones situation. I'm looking at the Sam Darnold situation, and I'm saying, who is that next year? Baker Mayfield even. Who did we give up on? And now he's getting a second chance. And I want to get it in the door before he starts proving people wrong.
I really love that. And to be honest, he's not somebody I've thought too much about, but it makes perfect sense. You see all these reclamation projects in the NFL today. I think it's largely due because these young quarterbacks aren't often developed as much in college, which is a whole separate conversation, but they're also more athletic, more raw, bigger projects, but they're expected to contribute immediately. And that's why you see a lot of these guys not work out at first necessarily. But I mean, the list goes on and on. Baker Mayfield, Sam Darnold. You can even throw a guy like Geno Smith in there, who obviously had a horrible year, but had a few good years with the Seahawks. So Kyler Murray could be another candidate. And also, I mean, he's super mobile. He can run the ball like we were talking about with Drake May, which is super valuable. And that's really what worked out with Daniel Jones as well. So there's definitely upside there for a guy who could be going later in drafts like Daniel Jones was this year.
Yeah, and I think to put it into hindsight, because I think I'm talking a lot about the future, I think my real takeaway here is to not discount a guy because of what you saw last year. I think Daniel Jones is a guy who had a lot of juice early on in his career. He had the rushing game too. And I think a lot of the time we draft not for upside. Upside's all we talk about in the fantasy community, but we'll let these guys with upside drop to take a guy that could finish as the QB 15. It's like, but what does that really do for you? And so I love taking a shot on guys like this.
100%. And this next guy I want to bring up had probably even more upside in hindsight or more production than I think most people considered even his ceiling to be. And that is the darling of George Pickens. I know he is one of the most loved players in our fantasy community. Certainly one of the most entertaining on and off the field, one of the funniest players in the league, but also just incredible. I mean, he had a beyond phenomenal season. He was getting drafted as wide receiver 28, finished as the wide receiver 5. And a lot of my takeaways here are similar to the ones you had for Javonte, just given they're on the same offense and they're both newer additions to the offense this season. But when you look at it, George Pickens really had the perfect storm for fantasy success. A high-powered offense with a proven great quarterback, especially at passing the ball, Dak Prescott being one of the better pocket passers in the league. The offense as a whole being really explosive. And then, of course, like you mentioned earlier, the very, very bad defense, which is awesome in the fantasy world. You want bad defenses. So everything really came together beautifully for him. And I think we all got scared by what we saw in Pittsburgh. And we still acknowledged the talent. I think most people would admit, even prior to this season, that we thought George Pickens was really good. But there definitely was some skepticism because the production wasn't there, playing with guys like Kenny Pickett and Russell Wilson. And also there was just this concern that CeeDee Lamb is in this offense and he's a true alpha receiver, which is true to a large extent. But I think what my major takeaway here, and this is something I have to remind myself every draft season, is when you invest in a receiver, you're not just investing in that receiver, you're investing in his quarterback and you're investing in the offense and the entire team, really, defense included from a game script perspective. And that should really be prioritized over taking a mediocre wide receiver one on an unproven or not very good offense. And George Pickens is probably the best example of that ever, having the type of season he did. So this offseason, looking forward, look at those receivers that change situations, whether they themselves change teams or they have a quarterback change, and really bake that into the evaluation of the player. George Pickens being one of those players as he's set to hit free agency this year.
I have a question for you on that because I've been all over the camp of there's no way they're going to pay George Pickens. All they keep talking about is they got to pay him. There's no money there. Let's say they do. Let's say they pull off George Pickens in free agency. Who are you drafting first, him or CeeDee Lamb? This was such a weird season because you can look at the production and say, oh, well, CeeDee Lamb was out. Even in games that they played together, George Pickens was outproducing CeeDee Lamb. Like, is that something that you think goes on in next season?
It's definitely in the range of outcomes, and it's a great question. I still think I lean CD, hopefully being fully healthy next year, probably being the higher volume guy in the offense. George Pickens still having huge play potential. How I think this shakes out, granted it's early, is their ADPs are very similar. I think a lot of people actually have Pickens going a little bit earlier right now. Granted, a lot could change. I think if that's the case, CD ends up being the better value. But either way, if they're both there, that's a good pick. It's a good offense. The defense probably won't be very good again. Dak will still be there. And it's a great combination of both floor and ceiling for both of those players if they're both in Dallas.
You talk about ambiguous situations too. That's like a gold mine. Both guys are getting pushed down because no one knows who to draft, so they just kind of go in the same spot. And it's like if you hit the right one this year, if you would hit George Pickens, like gold mine. I'm gonna jump into my third guy. I wanted to go with somebody like not so polarizing, so I went with Kyle Pitts. ADP of tight end 16, finishes the tight end 2, which is like the funniest statement possible. And I wrote down in my notes, two things can be true. Yes, his production came largely from one game, but that game did happen. And it
Right.
does. I think I keep hearing that and it's driving me nuts because everyone's saying like, well, if you took away that game, but that game happened. Kyle Pitts is a tight end 2 this year. And the hindsight part of this is probably the hardest of all now 5 players we've listed because Kyle Pitts, the whole narrative is just the unicorn. He's an unbelievable talent. He's in a system that was looking like there's not that many mouths to feed. You've got Bijan, Drake London, and Kyle Pitts. Yeah, Darnell Mooney's there, but like I'm not concerning myself with Darnell Mooney targets getting taken away from Kyle Pitts. I think people are really excited going into the year. He did his normal thing. He had his up games, his down games, and then he kind of exploded down the stretch. I personally, looking at Kyle Pitts, I think that I'm in next season.
Don't
And
do
I
it to
think I'm going to
yourself.
regret saying that.
Don't do it.
I'm going to say the thing that every single person in fantasy football loves to say, but Kyle Pitts just turned 25 years old. And I'm going to give you another argument right now. If you take away that monster game, the game that everyone says, if he didn't have that, Kyle Pitts fucking sucks. Kyle Pitts still had the second most receiving yards of his career, behind, of course, his rookie season. He still had the most catches of his career and the most touchdowns, which is incredible because he did the thing where he did 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which means you're guaranteed 6 touchdowns from Kyle Pitts next season. And so I don't have that much hindsight to talk about here. What I will say is when you've got a guy that is an unbelievable freak of nature talent and you can draft him at the tight end 16, basically a last round pick, you should be using those picks for outlier athleticism, outlier college production, those kinds of things. And like, we keep harping on it, but like upside, upside, upside. And I think I was completely done with Kyle Pitts, and now I'm all the way back in, and next season he's going to suck. But I do think there's something to be said about these guys that it takes a few years to get going. But even look at Quentin Johnston in LA, where he had such a good profile coming out of TCU, couple bad years, everyone gave up, then thought maybe last year's a fluke. Now he's put 2 seasons together, and now we're like, maybe Quentin Johnston's a thing.
I hate that you're right because it's Kyle Pitts, but you are right. I mean, somebody who has that athletic profile going as the tight end 16, it's like, what's the point of drafting like freaking Dalton Schultz with the,
Right.
yeah, as the
Perfect
16th tight end
comparison.
off the board when there's not that same upside. So I hate that you're right. You are. Now let me ask you a fun question. Kyle Pitts, impending free agent. There's definitely a lot of chatter he'll get the franchise tag, but let's say he doesn't. Let's say he moves on. Obviously, there's a lot of different situations he could land in, but just broadly speaking, are we more excited about him going into next year if he stays with Atlanta or if he's gone?
It would have to depend on the spot, but I would say probably if he stays in Atlanta, I think he's building rapport there with both like Kirk and Penix, whoever is going to be getting the starting job by like midseason. Honestly, who knows? The Falcons will probably try to trade up and draft another quarterback, so
Good
maybe I
point.
changed
That's
my
a good
mind.
point.
But yeah, I would say I'm more comfortable with him if he stays in Atlanta.
That is probably correct. I hope he stays in Atlanta more than anything, just because that's the funniest outcome of all of us having this same debate we've been having for the better half of a decade now. Kyle Pitts in Atlanta, will it work or will it not?
I hope we're podcasting in 2 years and we're coming off of the next good Kyle Pitts year after the bad one, and I'm
Yes.
going to be all the way back in on him again.
100, and he'll only be like 27, and it's like he's still 3 years
He's
removed
only
from 30.
27.
Yeah, it's every year, and there's a lot of fatigue with Kyle Pitts, and I think that's actually the reason this next player fell to where he did in drafts. And that's somebody I know you were all over, you're a big fan of. I personally didn't really see it, and that's Chris Olave. I actually like didn't believe my eyes when I saw that he finished as the wide receiver 6 this year. I had to like triple, quadruple check multiple sources. Chris freaking Olave was the wide receiver 6 this season. He was getting drafted as the wide receiver 36, super under the radar, probably because it was with the Saints, but super under the radar, one of the best values in fantasy this season. And I almost feel like I'm contradicting myself a little bit talking about him versus George Pickens when they are kind of the opposite. I talked about Pickens being wide receiver 2 on a great offense, Olave being the number 1 in an offense with quarterback concerns and an offense that didn't seem like it'd be very explosive. But I do think there are actual valuable takeaways from this. And in the case of Olave, it's to buy the dip on super talented receivers, especially if they're coming off injuries that won't actually impact their next season. Olave, I don't think many people would question his talent. He was a high first round pick. We've seen the production at the NFL level as well. He was going at about the 3rd round or so each of the prior 2 seasons. And I think it was just a lot of frustration and fatigue that we built as a fantasy community. I mean, he blew people's seasons, especially in 2024, lost people their leagues. He didn't play a lot of games, especially down the stretch. And I think we just kept pushing him down because of that, in combination with the fact we were out on the Saints. But in reality, he's a super talented receiver, and it was probably unfair and unjustified to have any injury concerns going in this year. Obviously, the concussions, as a fan, you hate to see that happen, and you sort of cringe when you watch Chris Olave play football and he takes those big hits. But it's not like he tore his Achilles or his ACL or anything down the stretch. I mean, he went into the season fully healthy, and a lot of people, myself included, kind of wrote him off as somebody who's not going to play a lot of games this year when that's completely just unfounded. So that's my biggest takeaway. Buy the dip on super, super talented receivers who are going later in drafts than they typically do, especially if part of the reason they're going later is for false injury concern.
I think this is exactly what this exercise is for, which is removing biases, getting out of the emotional state of fantasy football, which we all play with, and just kind of looking at something for what it is. A hyper talented wide receiver in an offense where he was bound to get a million targets, which is exactly what happened. And like you said, it's the exact opposite situation of Pickens. There was no one else to go to. Got Juwan Johnson, I guess, but like
Yeah.
you look back and hindsight's 2020.
5.
concussions, I mean, hindsight's 2025. The concussions were obviously scary because he had what, 5 going back to college, and
Right.
so one more, they were gonna have to take it seriously, and, there was a debate, you keep him out multiple weeks if he does get one.
Right.
But like you said, this isn't a torn Achilles, this isn't a torn ACL, he's not coming back at half speed, like, he was gonna be Chris Olave, which it's so incredible how talented that Ohio State wide receiver room was if your dad wasn't an NFL player.
Yeah, that's true. It's crazy to think.
I'm not here to name names, but
You know what? I look forward to having a full off season of trashing on Marvin Harrison Jr. I really look forward to doing that with you, Mitch.
if you'd like to hear us trashing Marvin Harrison Jr., make sure to hit that subscribe button and hit the bell to be notified every time we drop a brand new episode.